Hey everyone, welcome or welcome back. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. And today I have a heinous history case for you. We are going all the way back to the 1870s. The story that I'm going to tell you today is very undercovered. In fact, I couldn't find even one other creator that has covered this one. So there's a good chance that you've never heard of this case. It's a short one, but it's wild. Today we're talking about the strange and horrific case of Robert Turner. And to this day, we don't know the full extent of Robert Turner's crimes, but the people back then compared him to the Bloody Benders. And if you don't know about the Bloody Benders, I have covered that case already, and I will leave a link to that in the description box. But the Bloody Benders were a family of serial killers back in the early 1870s, which was just right before Robert Turner's crimes came to light. So that is what we will be talking about today. But before we get into the story, let's briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Trade. Today, the temperature in my area got up to 99 degrees Fahrenheit, and I can't tell you how ready I am for the cooler fall months, but until those days finally arrive, I can keep cool with cold brew coffees from Trade. A tall glass of iced coffee is the perfect way to stay caffeinated in the summertime, and Trade has partnered with 15 expert roasters from all over the country to bring you the best quality coffee specifically designed for making cold brew. And you can find all of the essential equipment to make cold brew at home on Trade's website. They have everything you need. I use my Hario cold brewer all the time, and they could not have made this process any easier. You just put the coffee in the filter, add water, put the cold brewer in the fridge for a few hours, or you can prep it before bed and leave it in the fridge overnight. That's typically what I do. And when you wake up, you'll have fresh cold brew coffee to enjoy throughout the day. I love Trade because they've allowed me to try out so many different coffees that I probably never would have had the chance to try. One of my favorite things about traveling is trying out little hole-in-the-wall coffee shops. My family and I just got back from Seattle, and we visited quite a few coffee shops. And having a service like Trade is kind of like having that experience, except without all of the traveling cost and, actually physically going anywhere because the coffee just arrives on my doorstep. The subscription options are very flexible, so you can choose the right fit for you, and you can also cancel anytime. I highly recommend giving Trade a try. We've been using this service for a while now, and we still get excited when we open the mailbox and find a new coffee inside. And now is the perfect time to give Trade a try because they're offering my viewers 50% off 1 month of cold brew. Just go to drinktrade.com/summer to get 50% off 1 month of cold brew. That's drinktrade.com/summer or scan the QR code on the screen. A big thank you to Trade for the continued support on this channel, and now let's get into the case. Robert Turner was born in 1839 in the state of Illinois, and he was the oldest of 8 children to Albert and Margaret Turner. And I'm really sorry, I forgot to mention this in the intro, but I could not find any pictures of Robert Turner. I could not find any photos really related to this case at all. So I'm just going to have to get creative when it comes to the visuals for this video. And Robert did not have the easiest childhood. His family was very poor. There were a lot of mouths to feed, and times were tough. When he was about 10 years old, his family moved to Grant County, Wisconsin, and they settled in a village called Potosi. And that's pretty much all the information that I could find about Robert's childhood. And when Robert was about 18 years old, his father passed away. This was a huge tragedy for the family, and it really put them in even more of a financial bind because he had been the main breadwinner. And this was kind of a turning point for Robert because with his father gone, he was now considered the man of the house since he was the oldest. He felt this immense pressure to earn enough money in order to take care of his mother and his siblings. And for the next 5 years, that's exactly what he did. He worked odd jobs around town, basically whatever he had to do to earn money for his family. And then in 1863, he went into the military and he served for about 2 or 3 years. And then when he got out of the military, he went right back home to Potosi and he basically picked up right where he left off. He started just taking jobs around town wherever he could in order to provide for his family. This time, though, he did have the help of some of his younger brothers. His brothers Albert and Newton Turner started working and pitching in with the family finances as well. But after Robert got out of the military, people started to notice some strange behaviors. First of all, Robert became very paranoid. He constantly had this feeling that people were out to get him. But more specifically, he thought that Dutch people and the Freemasons were out to get him and they were trying to kill him. There were times when his mother would make him some coffee or tea and he would just throw it all out because he was convinced that it was poisoned. He was also convinced that the Dutch and the Freemasons were going to burn him alive. So it's pretty obvious that Robert was struggling with his mental health. There was definitely some undiagnosed mental illness there for sure. And on top of the paranoia, Robert also started suffering from very extreme headaches, and he would just be constantly complaining to his mother about this pain in his head. So Robert is obviously under a lot of pressure. He's trying to keep his family afloat. He's working super hard to provide for them, him, but he's still not making much money. Even with the help of his brothers, the family is still just scraping by. And at the same time, he's acting really bizarrely. He's paranoid. He's having these really horrible headaches. It's actually pretty sad because he was being tormented day in and day out, and he was still trying really hard to function. And unfortunately, things would soon take an extremely dark turn. So back in the 1800s, there was a position in local government called Community Overseer of the Poor, and this person was an elected official, and they were in charge of providing welfare to the underprivileged townspeople. If it seemed like a person in the community needed financial help for an extended period of time, maybe they were elderly and they would never work again, maybe they had some sort of disability and they couldn't work, they would sometimes be sent to a place called a poorhouse. Poorhouses were facilities where people could be sent if they could not financially support themselves in the long term. They would also house people who had been convicted of begging in the streets and people who were suffering with mental illness, so people like Robert. And these poorhouses were not the nicest places. People living in there were often mistreated, they were overworked, but that's maybe a video for another day. If you were sent to live in a poorhouse, you were considered an inmate, but oftentimes the inmates would be allowed to come and go as they pleased for the most part. And the poorhouses were usually situated on the same grounds as poor farms, where people would be required to work if they could. Like if they were physically able to do manual labor, they would have to work on the poor farms. So in 1871, realizing that there was something wrong with Robert, the decision was made to send him to a poorhouse. And I'm not sure who made this decision. I'm not sure if the overseer of the poor made the decision or if Robert's family requested that he be sent there. But either way, Robert was now in the poorhouse, and since he was still young, he's only about 32 at this point, and he's still physically fit, he was put to work on the farm. But Robert's strange behavior quickly became a topic in the poorhouse. First of all, the head of the poorhouse one night walked into Robert's room and he discovered that Robert had completely ripped apart his mattress, like completely shredded it. And when the head of the poorhouse asked Robert why he had done this, Robert told him that he knew that they were planning to burn him alive. So the guy tells Robert, nobody is planning to burn you alive. And he, sat and talked with him, and he did manage to get him calmed down. But this kind of behavior would just happen randomly. Robert was suspicious of the people at the poorhouse. He would randomly ask them what they were planning to do to him. He just always seemed really scared, and they would have to constantly reassure him that they were not going to hurt him. So like I mentioned earlier, the inmates were allowed to leave the poorhouse, and they could go and find jobs elsewhere, or they could leave and go see their families for a while. And about a year after entering the poorhouse, Robert went back to his mother's house in Potosi for a visit. Now, as far as I can tell, all of the other 7 siblings still lived with their mother Margaret in that same house. And one night when Robert was in for a visit, his brother Newton was asleep in his bed, just peacefully sleeping, and all of a sudden he is woken up with a blinding pain on the side of his head, and he can see that he's bleeding. And he quickly realizes that he has been struck in the side of the head with a blunt object. And who does he see in his room? His brother Robert. Of course, Newton immediately knows that Robert has hit him over the head with what he later discovered was a hammer. And when Newton asks him why he's done this, Robert just starts denying it up and down, and he tells Newton that it was actually an intruder who had come into the house, hit him over the head with this object, and then he saw the person run out of the house. Now, the family was well aware of Robert's declining mental health at this point, and even though up to that point he had never been outright violent, Newton knew that Robert had been the one to attack him. He was lying. There was no intruder. So Newton ended up locking Robert into a room until morning, and then as soon as the sun came up, he hauled him right back to the poorhouse. And the day after that attack on Newton, the family found a butcher's knife hidden in a nook of their fence, and they immediately knew that Robert had hidden that there, which is terrifying. Robert would later admit to other people at the poorhouse that he had been the one who had attacked his brother, but he said that he had to do it because Newton was taking all of his money and threatening to kill him. Thankfully, Newton did not lose his life in that attack. He did, however, lose a portion of his earlobe, and he also had a very serious injury to the side of his head, but he was at least still alive. However, Robert's next victim would not be so lucky. By the fall of 1873, Robert was working in a town called Clifton for a man only referred to in the research as Mr. Bailey. Mr. Bailey had hired Robert to cut hoop poles from the trees on the Bailey property. I had no idea what the hell a hoop pole was, and so I needed to know because that's just who I am as a person. They are long wooden poles that are cut up from various types of trees like hickory, ash trees, hazel trees, and they were commonly used around farms back in the day as rollers to make it easier to like move heavy materials around the farm. They could also be split and used to make barrels and baskets, and they were widely used as stiffeners in those really big hoop style skirts that were popular back in the 1800s. So Robert is working for the Baileys, and he's also living there at their house as well. Now, the research wasn't clear on whether or not Robert was still full-time living at the poorhouse, and maybe he was just on leave working at the Baileys. I'm not really sure. But I do know that Mrs. Bailey noticed that Robert started acting very strangely in late November of 1873. He was not sleeping well, his paranoia started flaring up again, and, she could just tell that something was off. Mrs. Bailey definitely noted this shift in behavior, but she never could have guessed what Robert was about to do. No one could have guessed. On the morning of November 29th, 1873, Robert went to his family's home in Potosi for a visit. And as soon as Robert arrived that morning, his family could tell that he was having an episode. He was very agitated, and his family would later describe his eyes as looking wild that day. But his brothers could not stay home and deal with him because they had to get to work. Albert and Newton left the home together, and they headed to their jobs at the mines. They were both working in a mineral mine at the time. And little did they know, Robert had grabbed an axe and he was following them to the mines. Albert and Newton eventually arrived at the mines, and they were working in two separate mine shafts that were about 25 feet apart from each other. So Newton starts making his way down into his mine shaft, and as he's headed down, he starts faintly hearing his brother Albert talking to someone. As far as I can tell, Albert and Newton were the only two miners there in the mines that day, and so Newton would have been confused when he heard Albert talking to someone. And so Newton yells up to Albert to ask him who he's talking to, and Albert says Robert, that he's talking to Robert. This did not seem to worry Newton, and so he just continued to work. That was until he suddenly heard a loud crash coming from Albert's mine shaft. And then he heard Robert yell down to him, "Newton, you need to come out. I've just cut Albert." So Newton immediately starts making his way back up the mine shaft, thinking that there's been some sort of an accident and he needs to go help his brother. But once he gets about 5 feet from the top of the hole, Robert appears at the top and he's holding an axe. And he looks down at Newton and he says, "Wait. I need you to make a promise to me before I let you come up. You have to promise me that you will help me and you won't tell anyone about what you're about to see." At this point, Newton was pretty worried. He did not realize just how badly Albert was actually injured. And now with Robert saying all of this, he started thinking the worst has happened. And so just so he will be allowed to exit the mine shaft safely, he agrees to Robert's terms, but he tells him to put the axe down so that he will feel safe enough to come out, which Robert does. He throws the axe on the ground. So Newton makes his way out, and before he can even go over and check on Albert, Robert starts telling him his plan. He says, "Okay, now you are going to help me fill in this hole, the hole that Albert was lying in, and we are going to just tell people that Albert ran away and no one will ever know what happened." But Newton really wanted to get Albert out of that hole. And so he says, "Let's don't fill in the hole. We could get into big trouble, especially if Albert's still alive. We need to go get help. We should just go run into the village, get help, and we'll just tell people that Albert fell down the shaft. People get hurt in mines all the time. They'll believe us, you won't get in trouble, and we can get him out." But then Robert says something that would have completely terrified Newton. He says, "Well, I cut him pretty bad." And Newton decided in that moment that he had to go quick and go get help. And so he starts heading back to Potosi. And Robert actually started following him, likely trying to talk Newton out of telling anyone. And he also mentioned to Newton that the reason that he had attacked Albert was because there were too many people in the family and someone needed to go. Once they got about halfway home, Robert stopped walking with Newton and he disappeared. He just took off. By the time Newton got help and they made it back to the mine, Albert was dead. Actually, after pulling the body out of the mine shaft, they realized that Albert had died immediately following the attack because Robert had nearly chopped Albert's head clean off his body. His head was literally hanging on by a small section of skin. This had been a brutal attack. So the police set out on horseback to find Robert, and it took them a few days, but they did finally track him down. He did try to put up a fight at first, but they eventually apprehended him and they took him down to the jailhouse to be charged with the murder of his brother. Now, of course, word traveled very fast around the area, and now that the community knew that they had a killer living in their midst, they started wondering if maybe Robert was responsible for some of the other murders in the area. Apparently, several mysterious murders had happened in Grant County around that time, and now the question was being asked, could Robert have more victims? About a week before Albert was murdered, a 14-year-old boy named Olney Neely had gone missing. Olney had been working for a family in Ellenboro, and he had left in late October of 1873 to go visit his family, but he had never made it and no one had seen him since. And the path that Olney would have had to take to get back home was right through Clifton, right past where Robert had been working at the Baileys at the time. So a group of townspeople went to Clifton and they started traveling down that same path that Olney would have taken. And they started searching each side of the road to see if they could find any clues. And they found him. They found 14-year-old Olney Neely's body, and his head had been nearly severed, only hanging on by a small piece of skin, basically identical to Albert's wounds. When they found Olney, he was still clutching a package that he had been carrying under his arm. Robert was questioned about Olney and he immediately confessed, but he claimed that he had just been minding his own business that day, cutting hoop poles, when Olney passed through and he started coming towards Robert, yelling with a club in his hands. So he said in self-defense, he struck Olney 3 times with his axe. Now remember, I said that Olney was still clutching a package under his arm when his body was found. So how could he have attacked Robert with a club if he was still holding on to that package? So of course, this was not true, and we'll never know how the attack actually started. We'll never know how Robert lured Olney over to him. All we know is that Olney met a terrifying and tragic end at the hands of Robert Turner. Once police realized that Robert had killed before, they were like, okay, are there any other murders that you need to tell us about? And Robert said, as a matter of fact, I do. And he proceeded to go into detail about 2 other murders. He claimed that he had killed one man in a ravine behind the poorhouse, and he killed another man when he was working in the town of Muskota. He said, one of them was a red-headed fellow that I killed in the deep ravine back of the poor farm. The other was a man on the road to Muskota. I went up there to get work, and when about 2 miles from Muskota, I met a man in the road whom I knew wanted to kill me. I had a 4-pound weight in my pocket that I had got at a store, and I struck him 2 blows over the eye, killing him. I dragged him out of the road and into a thick stand of hazelbrush and left him. It was on the east side of the road, just where there is a bend. Now that is a pretty detailed account, and knowing what we know about Robert, I personally believe that he did commit these 2 other murders. Robert actually ended up confessing to killing at least 40 other people over the years, but unfortunately I could not find any more information about this. I don't know if they were ever able to prove any of these other murders. I don't know who these other victims are, but with all of the mysterious murders that had plagued that area, it does seem plausible that Robert was actually telling the truth. Robert said that the reason that he had killed all of these people was because there were too many people in the world and he had been chosen to bring down the population. And he even continued his mission to bring down the population while he was in prison. Robert was a very volatile, dangerous prisoner, and he violently attacked multiple other inmates, and he even managed to set his bed on fire. There was something seriously wrong with Robert. The police who interviewed him would later say that he seemed totally normal, like nothing really to note when he was having basic conversation, but when they started talking about the murders, Robert looked like he was enjoying it, like he was relishing and reliving the details of these murders. One of the investigators said that when he talks about the murders, he, quote, seems to be possessed with a strong desire for blood and gloats over his fiendish transactions with apparent relish. Now, there was no question that Robert had killed at the very least his brother and Olney Neely, but they needed to determine if he had been insane at the time, because his defense was that he had been insane. A trial was held and multiple people testified. Many people gave testimony about Robert's paranoia. His brother Newton talked about not just what happened to Albert that day, but also how Robert had attacked him with a hammer the year earlier. But a few of their neighbors and some of his previous employers testified that Robert had never acted in any way that would make them think that he was having some sort of mental health issue. Even the people at the poorhouse said that he could talk to you totally normally most of the time, but then other times he would be super paranoid and unsettled, and he would say really off-the-wall things. And in the end, the jury decided that Robert Turner was not insane, and they found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in the Wisconsin State Prison. Robert died in 1902 at the age of 63. While we'll never know if Robert's claims that he had killed at least 40 people were true, it is believed that he has many more victims than the police were ever able to prove. Like I said, there were several mysterious murders that happened in the area right around the same time as Robert was out on his mission to depopulate the earth. So could Robert Turner have been one of the most prolific killers of the 19th century? We'll unfortunately never know. And that is all I have on this case. Please let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. This one was a little shorter than normal, but I found it super interesting and I hope you did too. Don't forget, if you want to give Trade a try, you can click the link in my description box or scan the QR code to get 50% off 1 month of cold brew. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.